Welcome. This video was recorded live on World Sake Day, October 1st, 2020. It is a replay of one of the many sake presentations and panels that were live streamed at Sake Day USA, an online sake festival and fundraiser benefiting the American Sake Association, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The purpose of our nonprofit is to develop approachable and easy to understand sake education materials, as well as to provide affordable access to sake tastings and interactive events. If this presentation was of value to you, please consider a tax-deductible donation to the American Sake Association. To donate, please scan the QR code on the screen or visit our website at americansakeassociation.org. Thank you. Enjoy the video and kanpai.
Hello, everyone.
Yay.
Happy Sake Day.
Happy Sake Day. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. My pleasure. All right. Well, let me just briefly introduce myself, and then I'll get into
let's get right into it.
I've been in sake for 28 years. I started as a sake brewer, and I'm currently the Vice President of Sake at Young's Market, RNDC. And my passion, my life, everything about me is sake, and has been since I can remember. So
awesome
to be part of today, and I really appreciate the invitation.
We're happy you're here to talk to us.
So give me a brief second while I figure this thing out.
Sure, yeah. There you go.
All right. Oops. I'm going too fast. Okay. All right. Well, I over the years, I've learned about talking about sake is it's great to talk about the flavors, and this sake is different from this sake. But what really intrigues me is the history behind the sake. How did this sake come about? Who were the people behind it? This brewery's been around for 150 or 200 years. There's got to be some amazing stories behind that. And that's what my passion is. And that's what I like to tell people about the history of different parts of sake. So this is how apple yeast came about, and then a little thing called koon toka, which I'll go into briefly, but it's because of the apple yeast. All right. It's all about the story. Sake is brewed with passion. In order to do a sake brewery, let's just face it, none of us are really getting rich doing sake. We do it because we have passion behind it, as well as the brewers. A lot of sake descriptions can sound similar. If you have 10 or 15 different ginjos and you describe those ginjos, we know that they taste different, but there's only so many words to use to describe it. What makes each one different is the story behind it. That's what makes it unique. So I try to find out what the story is behind every sake that I'm talking about. So the Nakao Brewery was established in 1871 in Takehara, Hiroshima, which is, it's actually very close to Imada Shuzo that Monica mentioned earlier with the seaside. And little side note, actually Miho-san and Nakao-san are actually distant cousins, and they're about 11 kilometers apart. So it's in that Seto area of Japan, right off the coast of Hiroshima. Their Seikyo is their brand name, one of their brand names, which means true mirror, and that gives you a little indication of how they really look at sake deeply. Sake poured into a cup may be like a mirror, with the quality of the sake reflecting the sincerity in our brewers' hearts as they devote themselves to sake brewing. So the sake world changed in 1940, and I'm going to go into what happened. It was a discovery of apple yeast by Kiyoma Nakao, the fourth generation owner of Nakao Brewery. Susan, by the way, if you can find Tsuyoshi Nakao in the park,
yes,
bring him up, that'd be great, because I think he's joining us.
I found him, and I'm promoting him now to panelist so he can join us.
Okay.
It'll take a couple of seconds.
No worries. Kiyomi-san studied sake brewing from 1927 from Sakaguchi-san, which was basically at that time known as the god of sake. If you wanted to know and learn anything about sake brewing or anything about sake, this was a person that people learned from. Another part of this story is in 1935, the vertical rice polishing machine was developed, which was developed in Hiroshima. Now, this is maybe not a 1935 version, but this is an earliest version of a machine that I could find and take a picture of. I took a picture of this in Yamagata Prefecture and found this old vertical rice polish machine, but it changed how rice polishing could happen. Before this time, you could never polish rice down to a degree where, you know, we're getting to daiginjo's levels and things like that. So this really changed sake in a big way. Hiroshima is very important to the sake industry. It's really where the birth of ginjo was. Miura sensei in 1898 perfected the process of brewing with soft water in basically ginjo brewing. He developed tsukihaze koji. If you're familiar with koji, there's two different ways of doing it. When you're making ginjo daiginjo, you're thinly spreading the koji spores on so that it penetrates the grain rather than just staying on the outside. And he believed that was important for a slower, colder fermentation. So that was all part of what he processed and developed in 1898. Also important was Kimura-san, the founder of Kamotsuru Brewery in Hiroshima, because he really promoted the soft water brewing method at that time. So this was, again, no one had done this before, and this was all just trial and error and learning. And then Hashizume-san was instrumental in training brewers in the Mitsu Toji group, which became the Hiroshima Toji group. So he was also instrumental in taking these processes and teaching the brewers of Hiroshima how to work with soft water and how to brew sake there. I put a little note in there. It's an interesting side note about Saijo and Takehara. Takehara back in the day, say in the 1912 era, had 30 sake breweries. Today they have 3. Saijo, as everyone knows, Saijo is still well known for sake brewing and has a lot more breweries. So what happened to Takehara to where they fell off that much and Saijo continued? Well, I learned from a brewer in Saijo that Maigaki-san, he told me that because of the train system, when they built the trains, they were either gonna go through Takehara or they're gonna go through Saijo, and they chose to go through Saijo. So early, prior to World War II, the military of Japan was riding trains across the country, and they would stop off in Saijo, and then they would drink and whatever they were doing, and Takehara missed out on that. Therefore, Takehara ended up losing a lot of the sake breweries. And back then, sake was pretty much just consumed in your local region. It really didn't get across the country. So that's one reason why Saijo still today has a lot more breweries than Takehara did, because of that, the railway. So this is Kiyoma Nakao, the 4th generation Kuromoto. And some of the highlights of this story is going to be fermentation, fragrance, acidity. He studied for 14 years. He went across 2,000 different types of yeast and was trying to develop the first high fragrant sake. About this time, they weren't using yeast that was designed for sake brewing. There was very little of that going on. So it was really Kuratsuki Kobo, which is yeast that lives in the brewery, still wild yeast. So he wanted to create something that had high aromatics, but what kind of yeast was being used? So he studied 2,000 different types of yeast. One day, he was going to Kure, which is a local, a little day trip, a local city nearby, and he saw this apple cart and these wonderful apples. So he bought some, took them home, gonna eat them, and then he was thinking, I wonder if we can take yeast from this apple and develop apple yeast. And so that was part of the research. In 1940, he was actually successful in creating apple yeast, but it was very limited because the Kuratsuki Kobo, the natural wild yeast, was still much stronger. And then in 1947, he developed a process called Koon Toka, which is able to express apple yeast fully. And I'll go into that in just a minute. But in 1955, he won the inaugural prize for service to the craft of sake making because of his development of Koun Toka. So in 1948 and 49, his brewery making this apple yeast sake won first prize in the national competitions. And from 1949 to 50, it was used in the emperor's household because there's nothing else like it anywhere in Japan. This was a very, very special, one-of-a-kind sake that had never been developed before. And I know this is a little wordy. We don't have to read all of it. You can kind of read along, but basically, Akiyama-san became very, very famous in tasting throughout Japan, but he's reflecting back when he first got out of college and was first tasting sake, and had never come across anything like this. And if you look at the bottom, it says, even now, many, many years later, I cannot forget how I felt at that moment with the sweet aroma on his palate. And it was so exceptional that no sake could rival it. In the 3 years that Seikyo continued to offer its splendor, yielding its place to none. So in his mind, for those 3 years, that was the absolute best sake that he'd ever had, and he still remembered it many, many years later. That's what kind of impact this apple yeast sake had. In 1940, as I mentioned, he was successful in getting apple yeast to work, but you couldn't really tell it was brewed with apple yeast because the Kuratsuki Kobo, the yeast in the brewery, was taking over and becoming dominant. So in 1947, he finally came up with a process called Koun Toka that was perfected to where apple yeast could fully be expressed in the sake. And basically what he's doing is he superheated the koji rice and the steamed rice for 8 hours, basically making amazake. And then as it cooled down, he added the lactic acid and then added the apple yeast. Instead of taking 14 days like traditional yeast starters take, he was able to cut it down to 7 or 8 days. So this was a little bit more reliable, and it was faster, and it protected the apple yeast so that it could thrive and actually do its job, and it wasn't taken over by the brewery yeast. So that's what made the huge difference is Koun Toka. Today, Koun Toka is used across Japan. I ask every brewery I go to, do you guys use Koun Toka? And mainly in Western Japan, just about everybody's using it, and not as much in Eastern Japan, but it is used in Eastern Japan as well. It's a process that protects the yeast and it shortens the time for the yeast starter to go. And again, he won this award, the inaugural prize for service to the craft of sake making, because of this development. And this is why it's so important, is because it is still used today by many, many breweries across the country. But this sake really wasn't available until 1975. Why? Well, nobody knew what Ginjo sake was. It wasn't known to the public. They weren't sure that it would sell. And at the time, until 1989, there was a taxation system that made it just impossible to sell, because there's a thing called ikkyu nikyu, and it was based upon, you were taxed based upon what type of sake you made rather than how much sake you make, like today. So if you were making Daiginjo sake, you were getting taxed so much, you would have to charge so much that it wouldn't be worth it. Oh, I forgot to mention, I don't know if you noticed, but during the 1940s, when he developed the Koun Toka process in apple yeast, there was a little thing called World War II going on. Hiroshima, an hour and a half away from his brewery, was completely decimated, as we all know. So not only did he develop this during that time, but there was a war going on. It was amazing that he was able to still come across and get this accomplished despite all the things going up against him. We're dealing with COVID right now. I have a feeling that was nothing compared to what happened to Hiroshima in 1945 after it got bombed. Anyway, the taxation system was basically making it to where they could never sell it. So they never took it to market. Well, his son, Yoshitaka Nakao, he really preferred Western wine and spirits to sake. And I put, what? Because if anyone knows me, they know I can't imagine anyone liking wine or spirits better than sake. I don't get it. But apparently he did. But I can promise you, Nakao-san, are you there? Can you hear us? Can you unmute yourself?
はい、こんに
Hey,
ちは。
Nikao, I don't see you, but this is Nakao-san, who is the sixth generation owner of the Nakao Brewery, and this is his father we're talking about right now. Please say happy sake day to everyone. Happy sake day, 言ってください。
はい、ハッピー酒デー。乾
Hey, あり
杯。
がとう。
Happy Sake Day to you too. Thanks for joining us.
So his father preferred Western wine to sake, but at some point, and they never really sold this. It was made, they had it in the back burner, but it was never really used. At some point, his father tasted the apple yeast sake and was astonished and said, even I can drink this. We have to find a way to get this to market. I mean, that's quite a statement. Again, I can't imagine someone liking wine better than sake, especially a brewery owner, but Nakao-san's father apparently was that one of those people. So disregards the profit because the taxation system was still in place, he decided to go to market with it. So in those days, there was, in the 1970s even, there was this kind of thing known as the phantom sake, that every brewery had this one sake they were making that wasn't available to the public, competition sake, if you will. And people knew about it, but no, how can I get that? I've heard they have this mystery sake, this phantom sake. Well, they finally decided to release it. And they started selling it for 8,000 yen for ishobin. At the time, ishobins were 800 yen. So to pay 8,000 yen, everyone, you must be insane. But despite that, they sold out. And the reason was because no sake before this had ever been available to the public. The word got out in 1975. There was national TV attention to it. Yoshitaka Nakao was on national TV. They talked about it, and the announcer told him, he says, I have a feeling you're going to be busy tomorrow. Sure enough, the brewery called the next morning and said, we can't keep up. We're going to sell out. Even at 8,000 yen a bottle. There's Nakao-san, who's online with us right now, and his brewery continues to have high quality sake. And I can promise you, he likes sake better than wine. I've witnessed it many times, right, Nakao-san? And the brand is now, the apple yeast brand that he makes is now called Maboroshi, which means mystery. I also have to thank Henry Seidel, because this is part of Johto Sake, and I was actually with Henry the day that he made the arrangement with Nakao-san and signed the contract to start importing the sake. So my hat's off to Henry Seidel for making this happen. Aritani-san is the Toji at Nakao Brewery, current Toji, and he does a phenomenal job. By the way, he started in the sales department, and then he eventually became the Toji for the brewery. There's two sake available in the United States, and one is called Johto Daiginjo, the one with 72 clocks. That is kind of this is really a representation of what that sake was like in the 1940s. The 72 clocks represent 72 hours it takes to mill the rice down to a Daiginjo level. And the one on the right, the Maboroshi Kurobako Jumai Daiginjo, is a complete handcrafted, 100%, shizuku, everything you could imagine that makes it delicate. And it's not just a sake, it is a complete experience. Yeah, I can't even explain it unless you've tasted it. So my lesson basically is I want you to create your own dialogue about sake. Don't just concentrate only on the flavor, but what's behind the sake? What's the passion behind it? How did this sake come about? What's the history of this brewery? Because it is fun and fascinating to learn the stories behind these sakes. These bottles I have up here on the screen are other sakes that have amazing stories behind them. We just don't have enough time to go into every single story. But I wanted to give this as an example.
Yeah, and that's a great point. That's an excellent point, is that to dig deeper, it's not just about how it tastes.
Exactly. So let me stop share. There we go. Nakao-san.
Thank you very much, Mata-san.
プだった正しかったですか
Very good.
Okay.
Very good.
This
Thank
is a
you
bottle
so
of
much for joining us.
Johto Daigenjo.
Oh,
And,
thank you very much.
Oh, of course. This is my Kanpai sake for today. And this is a cup that I'm going to be drinking out of that I received from Nakao-san some years ago. So I think it's appropriate to have Nakao sake with the cup I got from Nakao-san.
Excellent.
Oh, there he is. Nakao-san.
Kanpai.
Kanpai. Kanpai. Thank you so much for joining us.
Nakao-san, kanpai.
Kanpai.
Bye.
Were there any questions,
Bye.
Susan, that came up that we need to answer?
Let's see, a lot of people thanking you for telling the story and digging deep, and for Nakao-san for joining us. A lot of people love the story. A lot of kanpais. I don't see any questions. Do you have questions?
Okay, cool.
That's okay. Oh, and you're a great storyteller. And
Well,
clap
thank you.
emoji. Yeah.
All right. ありがとうございます。Thank you so much. Nakao-san, ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございます。
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so much. We appreciate you guys being here. And I love Seikyo, so I didn't know the story about apple yeast, so now I will look at those sakes
There you
in
go.
a different
All right.
light.
Got it.